All right, let's talk about this book, The State by Pettit. I've already done a series of videos that I recorded as I read the book. Stunned at how bad it is and how authoritarian it is. Now, I mean, I got to talk about justification for talking about Pettit at all. Definitely less eminent than any of the other figures we've talked about. Although, he's a distinguished professor at Princeton or whatever. So he's like an eminent American academic, but he's not like, Plato and Hobbes and Hegel. And I guess I do not regard this as having the sort of quality that would justify attention. All right, but I guess I said the same thing about Jameson, and I guess there's a range of quality. One thing I'm doing is getting off the Marxist totalitarian left-wing tip for a minute. I think I don't know how to interpret what Pettit is doing here, but it might be sort of classical liberal totalitarianism. So I did a couple of videos on totalitarian implications of classical liberalism. And in some ways, Pettit would allow me to, he wouldn't allow me to explore that because there's not much going on in a way, but he would allow me to reassert it. Also contemporary, okay? Like this is an actual working philosopher alive today. Unlike, even Bourdieu, who I was talking about previously. Okay, now, there may be some true sentences in this book. And if so, I think they're the kind of things like, this kind of sentences would be like Hobbes said, and then a quotation. And then if the quotation is accurate, and this is Princeton University Press or whatever, Princeton University professor, probably is accurate, then that sentence is true, that Hobbes actually did say that. But in terms of any construction of the political in here, it's all fiction. It's all fiction. There is not a single true assertion in here about the political or political philosophy. All right, really. And he almost says that, he's one of these guys, and again, coming out of the classical liberal tradition, who's perfectly happy to be trafficking in fictions. If he thinks he's not trafficking in fictions, he's out of his mind, okay? This thing is really very pitiful. So I'm going to get some, I'm going to read some quotes. One thing I think we can safely say, this is not going to end up being a classic or something like I can't imagine that. There are great blurbs on the back, and some of the reviews have been positive, I guess. But that just discredits anyone who is approving of this. Oh my God. But anyway. And plus, the political vision is disgusting. And it's totalitarian. And he seems to be thinking that he's moving straight out of republicanism, that's one of his books, or classical liberalism to the univocal singular voice of the state, which is the key analytic category here, and is obviously fictional. Okay, the state doesn't have any voice, but its the ultimate conceptual requirement on statehood is to have a singular voice. The singular voice of a fictional entity, the state. I mean, this is his actual account, I think. In every functional state, there will be a voice operating under decision-maker laws that enunciates presumptively accepted and internalized decision-taker laws, and subject to a constraint introduced in the next chapter, that may play a similar role with this decision maker laws themselves. The decision maker, decision taker thing, I guess I said this before in previous video, it appears in half the sentences here. It's just gobbledygook, and there's no reason for it. It seems like, I mean, it's sort of like as such in Jameson or something, like it's supposed to be an impressive phase. But it's not. And it doesn't register, at least definitely not every time out, like register any particular distinction that's relevant to the point he's making. He can't say law without saying decision maker and decision taker. Insofar as the polity is organized around a personal or procedural voice, the citizens will rally around that voice, whether in official roles or not, taking the laws it enunciates to bind them individually as decision takers and to allow or require them, if they are decision makers, to take appropriate initiatives under decision maker laws. Insofar as the polity is organized around a personal procedural voice, insofar as it is, the citizens will rally around that voice. That's a typical sentence in Pettit. What, is that a prediction? Is that a definition? It can't quite be a fiction because it doesn't cohere sufficiently. Like, it doesn't make a world in any way. It just lies there like a, roadkill. Okay. All right. Now, the one reason for the singular voice of the state is that we require full incorporation. And what all that means, and this is one of the many totalitarian moments in Pettit, what full incorporation of the state means? Absolute universal obedience. He says that over and over. Absolute universal obedience. So first of all, good fucking luck. And second of all, that's what you're recommending, a fully incorporated state in the sense of a state with a single voice and personality and all that shit, and then also in the sense of a state that is universally obeyed, unlike any state that's ever existed so far. Thank God. The state that's universally obeyed is just going to kill you and your people, all right? And you're going to obey. You're going to get on the train. Now, I'm sure there's arbitrary stipulations and definitions according to which his fully incorporated state can't do that. I'm not doing political philosophy for a fictional world. I mean, like one of his central conceptions is genealogy. I did do this on a previous video. It's genealogy. It's a Nietzschean idea, obviously, Foucault. But he means something different by it than they do. For Nietzsche, a genealogy is the actual history. It's factual. For Pettit, it's fictional. Okay, a genealogy is just like a fictional story of how a state gets going or something like this. A fictional story of how money arises that are just sort of contradicted by the facts. Like anyway. Again, I'm less than impressed by the quality of political philosophy in the West, and this is a beautiful example. Like, shit can't suck any worse than this. We turn finally, here we are on page 98. We turn finally to the question of whether the functional polity should incorporate as fully as possible. Should it constitute a single agent? Are these possible facts, or are these impossible fictions, all right? Should the state, the United States, think about the government of the United States, let's say, should it incorporate as a single agent? Should it constitute a single agent, organized in such a way that ideally those who act in its name do so under a voice that has a univocal content and elicits universal obedience among its members? like a drill sergeant, I guess. A voice with univocal content that elicits universal obedience among its members. Should they do that? Should the state do that? Oh, it must by definition, maybe. According to Pettit. So that's why we're recommending the polity, the absolutist polity that we're going to recommend, because it's true by definition. This is a pretty good refutation of the whole idea of philosophy, actually. Like, if this is where reasoning takes you, then you need to get rid of it, I guess. Like, oh my God. But actually, half-decent reasoning would have corrected all these mistakes. And there's nothing in here but mistakes. In addressing these questions, we focus only on the functional or nomothetic state. What he means by function is hilarious too. And his argument for state legitimacy in terms of function, proper function or evolutionary function, is you're not going to see a more flimsy tissue of fallacies almost anywhere. Yes, should it be organized so that those who act in its name cannot intrude their own goals or judgments and are bound to enact only corporately endorsed attitudes? The people who work for the state are bound to enact only corporately endorsed attitudes. The attitudes of the person that is the state, I guess, or the people. In addressing these questions, we focus on the functional or nomothetic state. The repressive state, which he's against, I guess, may also be fully incorporated, except his state is sheer repression. May also be incorporated, but incorporation might take it even further from the functional ideal, not bring it any closer. The functional ideal. It should be clear that classical Athens, a broadly nomothetic state, is not fully incorporated. Rule of law state, nomothetic. Since it is organized around a voice that speaks with a discordant, inconsistent voice in its courts. So let me ask you that. Is that a good description of Athenian democracy? It is organized around a voice. Is Athenian democracy organized around a voice? And what the fuck does that mean? That speaks with a discordant and inconsistent voice. A voice that speaks with a voice. And it should be clear that a state may be broadly functional in the same way, yet operate in the presence of recalcitrance and disobedience among many of its officials or other citizens. Right. So, Athenian democracy does not constitute a fully functional state, a fully incorporated state. And neither does the Roman Republic. Why? Because it doesn't reduce to a single booming voice in the sky. No state does. But Pettit doesn't care, and he just keeps fictionizing. His biggest fictional character is the giant voice of the state booming from the clouds. There really is no such thing anywhere, and there never has been, and for very good reasons, man, because there's a diversity of people involved in the state, okay? And because the officials of the state also represent themselves and also pursue their own self-interest, okay? But don't just speak for an abstract concept in the sky. There are three salient reasons that the state should be fully incorporated, and again, this requires absolute universal obedience if it is to operate to the best functional effect. The first is the need for the state to be so organized in its decision-making that, unlike classical Athens or Rome, it can speak with a univocal voice in the laws it lays down. The second and third reasons derive from the need for the univocal voice of the polity to elect universal obedience, to elicit the need of the polity to elicit universal obedience, especially among certain officials. Would you say, here's a universal law, especially among X? A universal law that applies especially to women. That's a pretty good representation of the intellectual level that we're going at here. Of these, the second is the need for the state to be organized so that powerful bodies like the police and the military are obedient to the corporate voice, which is where, which is what. And the third is the need for the state to be so organized that others can rely on it to live up to its commitments. And then there's a whole section on the need for a single voice. All right. This is on page 104. An internal danger to any polity is the collapse of the system due to non-compliance with the law on the part of regular citizens, on the part of corrupt officials, or independent-minded officials, or civil disobedient officials, or among any who seek to overturn the government without regard to the decision-maker rules. What the fuck, decision maker? For the polity to domestically entrench the regime of law, ideally the rule of law, it must ensure that the law criminalizes relevant forms of deviance and dissension. This is the totalitarianism of Philip Pettit. It must ensure that the law criminalizes relevant forms of deviance and dissension. It must create a body with the capacity to uncover deviance and dissension, surveillance, I suppose, secret police, and it must enable the body to use coercive force against offenders where it is required to bring them before the judicial authorities for sentencing and sanction. This body will constitute a police force that guards against the breaching of decision-maker or decision-maker laws. He does suppose universal obedience, and he does suppose non-universal obedience because there's violations of the law, which, according to his definition, would indicate that the polity isn't fully incorporated. But these definitions are just slop, okay? The entire community, he says, on page 111, is subject to the discipline of one and the same voice. Where, what, why? The voice must ensure universal conformity. That's the term he uses on 113. Universal conformity to the law. And he says, the voice cannot be formed by a bottom-up, individually responsive process of the kind that majority voting illustrates. The form of a univocal voice of the state won't be bottom-up. It'll be top-down. Or it would be if there could be such a thing. Well, the voice that rules, he says. What's the ruler of a pettit polity? A voice. The voice. I don't know. He's been watching too much singing competition television. I got no idea what he's doing, man. Like the sovereign is a voice. It's not the people. It's not even the law. Is it the people? I don't know. It's the voice. A voice. A voice of no particular thing, I guess. I'll just take, just one more little indication of totalitarianism, I guess, in Pettit. Totalitarian liberalism, I guess. Like all the reasoning has little things to do with like sort of Hobbesian rational contractors trying to maximize their goods and stuff like this. There is in here like a Hobbesian kind of hypothetical contract argument for the legitimacy of state power in general. and it's a complete non-starter. I mean, it's just like, it's the worst like fictional bullshit you ever saw. And then when it gets extended into absolute state speaking with a single univocal voice. Do you think the phrase single univocal voice, which appears in this thing hundreds of times in this thing, could be cut down to a single voice or a univocal voice? Actually, a univocal voice is redundant, so let's make it a single voice. No, you have a univocal voice. Fuck, whatever. As this may be true of a regime that people jointly sustain, so it will certainly be true of a despotism or tyranny that people do not accept, even in our minimal sense of acceptance. The ground of legitimacy, like the social contract moment in Pettit, is it's not becoming the lawgiver of yourself. It's not being the author of the law. It's acceptance. Now, of course, with the ultra coercive state that he's picturing and affirming, acceptance is impossible. See the last video. Obviously impossible to accept voluntarily the coercive force expressed by the voice of the state. This explains the absurdity in an infamous claim made by 16th century Etienne Le Boetie, who was immortalized in Michel de Montaigne's essay on friendship. Le Boetie maintained that those who live in subjection to any tyrant are guilty of voluntarily sustaining the tyranny. The kernel of truth in the claim is that if all citizens rose at once, they could almost certainly overthrow any tyrant. But that truth scarcely makes it reasonable to argue that they could jointly reject it if they wished. So he denies, I think, there that that people are under a state, or in their voluntary, that they're in their servitude condition because it's voluntary. Like Boetie says, like the people obey not because of the force that's threatened, but because they don't want to have power and they want to be told what to do. Okay. Pettit's response is, well, I guess really his response is that's neither here nor there, but we are going to tell them what to do. Like maybe they want to be told what to do, maybe they don't. Okay. But we'll be telling them what to do because we'll be wielding the biggest voice in the universe. All right, so like I say, this is also like the way you get here is by this hundreds of years of fictions. The Leviathans, the races, the classes, the states, the state as an imaginary agent and stuff like this. Like just constructing fictions and then asserting in the most serious way that they're true and essential and all we need and all we want and they are legitimate. And then asserting they are not real, i.e. fictional, and asserting that they're real, perfectly real, the ultimate social facts. All right, so that's Philip Pettit, and I think there might just be one more episode on Slavoj Žižek. I'll leave you with that.